Welcome, dungeon hackers. Today we are taking a look at something that has been popping up a lot on YouTube, and that is the fact that the orcs have been removed from the monster manual. We're going to take a look at what that actually really means and see what else has been taken out of the monster manual that didn't make it into the 2024 version. What they've done is they've mostly taken creatures like the orc that in the past was a playable species as well as a monster, and just made them into the humanoid category, and then the various humanoid stat blocks are what's used in their place. But there's not really a good comparison between all of them. Each of those different monster races, like the orc, have unique abilities and unique lore tied to them that is now completely gone by simply creating a stat block called Scout and saying that all elves and dwarves and orcs and halflings that are scouts are all the same. The reason that it worked is because your standard monster type of orc isn't the kind of creature that the character was. When you make an orc character, you are an exceptional version of that species and not the base version. However, you still have the abilities associated with that species, and that's how come each of the species is a little bit different than each other. By reducing all the humanoid species down to these generic stat blocks, it means that an orc cultist and a gnome cultist are exactly the same, and your only option to make them different is to homebrew them to some extent. Now, you can always homebrew things. I talk about homebrewing on this channel all the time. However, as far as making videos talking about the mechanics of the game, you can't assume homebrewing. You have to use the mechanics of the game when you're talking about it. So let's take a look first at the orcs. Orcs are now just humanoids that can be playable characters, and because of this, they aren't in the monster manual as a standard monster that you can throw at the party. They're one of the humanoid stat blocks, so let's take a look at some of these stat blocks and see which one you might be able to plug the orc into. Let's take a look at the description of orcs in the player's handbook. Orcs are burly raiders with prominent lower canines that resemble tusks. They gather in tribes that satisfy their bloodlust by slaying any humanoids that stand against them. So let's look at some of these stat blocks then. Warrior infantry. Well, warrior infantry has pack tactics, which is not an ability that orcs normally have, and it just feels like they're stealing it from kobolds. That, plus the stats in general, are just too weak to compare to your standard orc. So maybe the berserker stat block would be better. I mean, that feels like it fits in better with the bloodied frenzy, but it is way too strong when you look at the challenge rating and hit points. Your standard orc isn't going to be a CR2, and so that one's not really going to work very well. Maybe a cultist? Again, it's way weaker than your standard orc would be. You could go with guard, which is, again, still too weak for a orc, and it's also way too generic and boring. The pirate might be too strong for a basic orc, even though you could have an orc that is a pirate. Now we get a little bit closer with the scout. The scout is at least the correct CR, but it just doesn't feel like a standard orc. A scout isn't brutish and strong like an orc. They're more nimble and stealthy. It just doesn't feel like a very good fit. But speaking of that, maybe the tough would be a better choice. It's again an appropriate CR for a standard orc warrior. However, it again has pack tactics. I'm not really sure why the orc would have pack tactics. Just feels again like you're stealing from the kobold. Although, when I look at this, I kind of don't understand why a tough guy would have pack tactics either. And none of these have the orc's aggressive trait that allows them to charge at something, which is very thematic for a tribe of bloodthirsty raiders. So trying to use any of these stat blocks just doesn't really fit right with the orc. And it kind of does a disservice to all orcs in all fantasy that has ever existed. You've taken everything that it means to be orc, one of the most classic creatures in fantasy, and just changed it into nothing. So who else got screwed in this? Well, it's another playable species, of course, the drow, the dark elf. Much like the orcs, they're a playable species, and because of that, they are represented simply by the stat blocks that we've already looked at, none of which really fit very well. Now, the drow have a much more elaborate stat block. Not only do they have a short sword or a hand crossbow, but they also have innate spell casting. They can cast Dancing Light, Darkness, and Fairy Fire. Now this is all represented in the player characters option when you're creating a character if you want to be this type of an elf. But it's not represented in any of the stat blocks in the monster manual for humanoids. So if you wanted to use this, you would have to add all the spellcasting abilities to those stat blocks, which would of course then alter the CR of that particular stat block. Now this isn't difficult to do. It's pretty easy to just say they can cast Darkness or Fairy Fire once a day each, but it does mean a lot more work for the Dungeon Master when their entire concept for creating the new monster manual was to make things easier for the Dungeon Master to run and to put everything needed to run in the stat block. And then they didn't give us stat blocks for some of the most classic enemies in the game. Orcs and Drow cover many of the enemies in the literature that they have published, not only in their adventures that they've published, but also in their novels that have been released. Again, we see that you could go with infantry, and that just doesn't really feel right, aside from not having the spells. Same with the cultists and the guard. Pirate is, again, a little too powerful. I mean, you can have a pirate drow, and that'd be fun too, but that isn't the standard drow. Nothing is really drowish, so you would have to combine one of these stat blocks with the drow spellcasting to even get anything that was reasonable. Now, part of the reason that this was all changed, according to the designers themselves, is that people were drawing comparisons between these different species and actual human beings. Well, I'm going to let you in on a little bit of a secret. None of the monsters in any of these books are real. Any resemblance between any of these creatures and any person in the real world is purely coincidental and is not real. You don't have to make all these changes in order to not offend somebody. All you have to do is simply say these aren't real people. So before we move on to a few more that were left out, let me know what you think about these two. These are the two that were playable species that got removed from the book. And let me know your thoughts on that and on the whole ideology of removing all these different creatures to avoid offending people. So who else got left out of the monster manual? Interestingly, it is very similar to the last two. It's the Duergar. The Duergar are the dark dwarves, or the dwarves that live in the Underdark. However, unlike the Drow, they're not a playable species. So you can't even take these and plug them into existing stat blocks and get anything close to the same feel, because there isn't any abilities within the player character species that you can add in. Essentially, all Duergar society has ceased to exist in the world of Dungeons and Dragons. And the Duergar themselves are so unique in their abilities that it's very difficult to draw a correlation to any of the stat blocks. The Duergar's ability to turn invisible and enlarge themselves is very interesting and thematic, not only in combat, but also in social and exploration type encounters. But none of that exists in the Monster Manual, and it's not in any of the Player's Handbook or the Dungeon Master's Guide either. So Duergars and their societies are gone. And just like the Duergar, the Deep Gnome is also gone. The Svisnerfblin, the Snurfsblin, Svirfneblin, the Deep Gnomes. They're the Deep Gnomes. But the interesting thing is that they aren't just like gnomes that happen to live in the Underdark. Just like the Duergar, they have a very unique society that is completely different from other gnomes. And just like the Duergar, they aren't a playable species within the Player's Handbook, so you can't just grab their abilities out of there and plug them onto another NPC stat block. Deep Gnomes also have interesting spell abilities like non-detection, blindness and deafness, blur, and disguise self, as well as a penchant for using poison. Those are all abilities that are completely different than any other gnome. And again, unless you know the lore behind them, they're completely gone from 2024 Dungeons and Dragons. And finally, lizard folk. Lizard folk are gone. Like, I don't understand what the deal is with that. Now, they're not completely gone. There are lizard folk in the game, but they are higher level lizard folk. They aren't your standard lizard folk. There's not a lizard folk commoner or a lizard folk warrior or even a lizard folk chief. We can see under the heading for lizard folk, it says that they dwell in wilderness suffused with primal magic. While many lizard folk are humanoids with varied skills, some forge powerful bonds with the elemental plane of Earth, granting them magical connections to the cycle of growth and rebirth. So that line right there is telling us that your standard lizard folk is just one of the stat blocks for humanoids, which again just falls short. Lizard folk are famous for trying to bite you in the face. And guess what none of the humanoid stat blocks have? No face biting powers. At no time is biting somebody in a stat block on any of the humanoids. So again, you can reflavor it, homebrew it however you want, but the lizard folk isn't there. Instead, they have the lizard folk Geomancer and the lizard folk Sovereign. And even the lizard folk Geomancer doesn't get a bite attack. I mean, at least the Sovereign does. But are you telling me these giant alligator-looking humanoids don't bite? When did the Sovereign learn to bite if he had never bitten before he became a Sovereign? Like, it just doesn't make any sense. In a quest to make sure that nobody was offended, Wizards of the Coast made everything vanilla. And they took away all my chocolate chip and pistachio almond. But in the interest of not just being a video where I complain about everything, I'm going to offer some solutions. Now, of course, the first obvious solution is, well, use one of the creatures from the previous edition. Or you could homebrew your own. However, like I said, while those are completely legitimate options, when I'm talking about a game system, I have to use the system as information. The preferred solution would be for Wizards of the Coast to include some of these in future source books. I could foresee them creating a Underdark source book with all kinds of information and lore about the Drow and the Deep Gnomes and the Durgar, along with many other creatures that live down in the Underdark. And that would be an excellent opportunity to include them. You could include regular orcs in just about any kind of publication. You could include lizard folk in any new releases of things like The Ghosts of Saltmarsh, or another settings book that takes place on a coast or in a swamp. I think the easiest solution is just to listen to some feedback from some of the content creators, mostly the ones far bigger than myself. And while you can't suddenly include them in the books that you've already printed and shipped, you can include those different creatures in future releases of different books. Overall, in my limited time seeing the Monster Manual, I do like it and the stat blocks overall. There's just a few issues that really irked me that I'm trying to get over and that I'm hoping Wizards of the Coast can fix in future releases. Like and subscribe and all that other stuff. Leave a comment, turn on the notification bell, hug your children, and make sure that you hold doors open for old people. But most of all, remember to keep on hacking the dungeon.